The old house stood silent, its windows dark, its door forever shut. Yet, the German shepherd never left, waiting, watching, guarding a home where no one would return. But then, footsteps approached. The house at the end of Willow Lane had always been a quiet one. Nestled between towering oak trees, its wooden frame sagged slightly with age. The once bright blue paint now faded to a pale whisper of what it had been. The mailbox stood rusted, its door hanging open, filled with letters that no one would ever read. Weeds curled around the edges of the porch, creeping up toward the windows, as if trying to reclaim the home that time had forgotten. Yet, despite its emptiness, the house was never truly abandoned. A lone German shepherd sat at the edge of the porch every single day, his thick coat ruffled by the wind, his amber eyes fixed on the dirt road stretching beyond the rusting iron gate. His name, given to him by the townspeople, was Ranger, and Ranger was waiting. No one knew exactly how long he had been there. Some whispered that he had been sitting in that very spot for months, while others claimed it had been years. Through seasons of rain, snow, and sun, Ranger never strayed far from his post. The people of the town had long since given up trying to coax him away. Many had tried. The old woman down the road, Margaret, had spent entire afternoons sitting on the porch steps, offering him food, calling his name softly, trying to reason with him. "Come with me, boy," she would murmur, her voice gentle. "There's no one left here." But Ranger would only look at her for a moment before turning his gaze back to the road, his silent vigil unbroken. He wasn't just any dog. He had been Henry Whitmore's dog. Henry had been a firefighter, a quiet man with kind eyes and calloused hands, known in town for his unwavering sense of duty. He had lived in the house for decades, alone except for Ranger, his only family after life had stolen so much from him. Henry never spoke much about the past, but the few who knew him well understood that he carried a heavy heart beneath his strong exterior. Ranger had come into Henry's life on a freezing winter night 6 years ago. Henry had been driving home when he saw a small bundle of fur curled up beside a dumpster, shivering in the cold. The pup had been barely a few weeks old, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat, his eyes dull with hunger. Henry didn't hesitate. He scooped the tiny creature into his jacket, warming him against his chest as he whispered, "You're safe now, boy." From that moment on, they had been inseparable. Mornings were spent walking through the fields behind the house, Henry's slow, steady gait matched by Ranger's eager steps. The dog would bound ahead, nose to the ground, chasing scents that only he could detect. Henry would watch with quiet amusement, sipping his coffee, the warmth of the rising sun spreading over them both. Afternoons were spent on the porch, where Henry would read from his old leather-bound books, one hand resting idly on Ranger's thick fur. They had a routine, an understanding, a bond that needed no words. And then, one day, everything changed. It happened in the middle of winter. A neighbor saw the flashing lights first, the ambulance parked in front of the house, the paramedics rushing inside. The door had been left slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. Henry had collapsed in the kitchen, his heart giving out before he could even call for help. The ambulance left just as quickly as it had arrived, but Ranger never left. The first night after Henry was gone, Ranger lay by the door, his ears perking up at every creak, every distant sound. His nose pressed against the wood, inhaling the faint traces of Henry's scent, willing him to return. Days passed, then weeks. Ranger never stopped waiting. Neighbors began to worry. They left food near the gate, watching from a distance as the dog sniffed cautiously before eating. Some tried to take him in, but Ranger would grow restless and scratch at their doors, whimpering until they let him go. He would always find his way back to the house, to the porch, to the spot where he had last seen Henry. The town's children whispered stories about him. "He's not a real dog," a little boy once murmured to his friend. "He's a ghost, waiting for someone who's never coming back. Another child, a girl with big brown eyes, had a different theory. "He's not waiting," she said. "He's protecting something." And in a way, she was right. The house still smelled of Henry. His boots remained by the door, untouched. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, a thin layer of dust beginning to settle over it. His old firefighter's jacket hung by the coat rack, the fabric worn, the smell of smoke and earth still clinging to it. It was as if time had frozen inside those walls, and Ranger refused to leave because leaving meant accepting that Henry wasn't coming back. Margaret came by often, sitting on the porch beside him. "You know, I used to tell Henry he was stubborn," she sighed, rubbing her hands together against the cold. "But I think you might be worse, boy." Ranger didn't move. He only blinked, his gaze never leaving the road. The town tried to move on, but Ranger couldn't. Seasons changed, the days growing longer, then shorter again. The house, once a warm place filled with life, grew colder with each passing month. The porch creaked under the weight of time, the windows turned into mirrors of dust and silence. And still, he waited. And then, one day something changed. Footsteps. Not the usual ones of passing neighbors or curious children. These were deliberate, heavy, belonging to someone who was coming for a reason. Ranger's ears perked. His muscles tensed. For the first time in months, his tail twitched ever so slightly. Someone was coming. And this time, it wasn't just another visitor. It was someone who could change everything. The wind carried the sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Ranger's ears perked up, his body tensing as he lifted his head. He had spent months hearing nothing but the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of passing cars, and the occasional voices of neighbors who tried, and failed, to lure him away. But this was different. The steps did not hesitate. They did not pause at the broken gate, nor did they slow at the sight of the abandoned house. They approached with purpose, crunching against the gravel of the driveway, bringing with them the scent of someone new. Ranger rose to his feet, his thick fur bristling slightly as he took a step forward. His amber eyes locked onto the figure that emerged from the path. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long coat that billowed slightly in the breeze. His boots were worn, his movements controlled, but his face was unreadable. There was something about him. Something that made the air feel heavier, as if his arrival carried a weight that could shift the very foundation of what had become Ranger's world. He stopped at the base of the porch, his gaze sweeping over the dog standing guard. Ranger did not move. The two stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. Then, the man spoke. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" His voice was low, quiet, but not unkind. There was an understanding in his tone, as if he already knew Ranger's answer. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark. He only watched, his ears twitching at the sound of those unfamiliar words. The man sighed, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He shifted slightly, reaching into his coat pocket. Not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to pull out something small and worn. A key. Ranger's eyes flickered to the object, then back to the man. "I guess I should introduce myself," the man murmured. He knelt down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "My name is Ethan Whitmore." The name rang through the air like a distant echo of something forgotten, but never erased. Whitmore, Henry's name. The connection was instant. Ranger stiffened, his mind grasping at a memory buried beneath months of solitude. He had heard that name before, not from Henry, but in the moments when the old man sat in his chair, staring at the photographs on the wall, his fingers brushing against a picture frame before he looked away. Henry had never spoken of Ethan, but Ranger had sensed something. A heaviness, a loss, a regret woven into the quiet moments of the man's life. Now that missing piece stood before him. Ethan exhaled, watching the dog closely. "I'm his son," he said. He hesitated, his fingers curling around the key. "I didn't make it back in time." The words were spoken softly, almost too softly, but Ranger understood them in a way only a creature of instinct could. This man carried the same grief he did. For the first time in months, something shifted inside Ranger. Not a surrender, not a release of his vigil, but a flicker of recognition. The man before him belonged to Henry. The wind whistled through the trees, shaking the brittle branches above them. Ethan's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable as he looked past the dog, toward the house that had once been his home. "I haven't been here in years," he admitted. "Not since—" He stopped himself, shook his head. "Doesn't matter now." But it did matter. It mattered to Ranger. The dog took a cautious step forward. His eyes searched Ethan's face, his ears twitching as he caught the scent of something familiar. Not Henry, not exactly, but a trace of him, a fragment of something long lost. Ethan watched him closely. He didn't reach out, didn't try to force trust where it had not yet been earned. He only waited. And for the first time since Henry had been taken from this house, Ranger was not the only one waiting. A past left in shadows. Ethan Whitmore had not seen his father in almost 15 years. The last time he had stepped onto this porch, he had been 22, angry, bitter, carrying a suitcase in one hand and a grudge in his heart. Henry had stood in the doorway back then, his firefighter's uniform still on, smelling of smoke and exhaustion. His voice had been firm but not unkind when he said, "Ethan, don't do this." But Ethan had been too consumed by his own pride, too restless to stay in a town that felt too small for his ambitions. "I have to go," he had replied. "I can't waste my life here." Waste? Henry's jaw had tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "Is that what you think this life is?" Ethan had looked away. He didn't want to fight, but the words spilled from his mouth before he could stop them. "I think you settled for less," he had said. "And I won't." That was the last thing he ever told his father before turning his back on him. Ethan had left for the city, chasing something he couldn't quite define: success, money, freedom. And in the process, he had let years slip by without so much as a phone call. Then, one day, a letter had arrived. It had been short. A neighbor had written it, not Henry himself. "Your father has passed away. The funeral was last week." Ethan had been too late. Now, standing on the same porch he had once abandoned, he felt the crushing weight of all the years he had let go. And Ranger knew. The dog stared at him, unblinking, unwavering, as if demanding an answer. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I messed up." The words felt empty against the wind. For the first time since he had arrived, Ranger moved closer. It wasn't an act of acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Ethan knelt down, his fingers brushing against the dog's thick fur. "I don't deserve to be here," he whispered. "But neither do you. You don't have to wait anymore." Ranger's ears flicked back. His muscles were tense, his body still unwilling to let go of his post. But the seed had been planted. For the first time in months, change had arrived. And the past was no longer buried in silence. The sky was an endless sheet of gray, the kind of color that made the world feel heavier, as if the air itself carried sorrow. The house stood at the end of the road, silent, forgotten by time, but not by those who once called it home, and not by the one who never left. Ranger sat on the porch, his ears twitching at the approaching footsteps. The wind howled through the dying trees, shaking their brittle branches like bones rattling in the wind. The dog's amber eyes stayed locked on the figure in the distance, a shadow stepping through the threshold of his world. A stranger, but not quite. The man stopped at the rusting iron gate, gripping its edge as if hesitating, as if knowing that stepping beyond it meant stepping into something he could never undo. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight. His breath left his lips in a fog, vanishing before it could reach anything real. He did not belong here. But neither did the house, empty and lifeless, waiting for an owner who would never return. Ethan Whitmore exhaled, his fingers tightening around the old key in his palm. The metal was worn, its edges smoothed by years of use. He shouldn't have come. And yet, he was here. And so was Ranger. The German shepherd didn't move, but his body was rigid, tense, as if he were ready to fight for what he had spent months guarding. "I don't even know why I'm back," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. His voice was raw, exhausted, barely above a whisper. But the dog heard it. The dog heard everything. Ranger growled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a threat, but it was a warning, a reminder that Ethan was nothing more than an intruder. Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't want me here, huh?" Ranger's eyes never left his. "I don't blame you," Ethan admitted, his voice rough. "I left. I should have been here, but I wasn't." His fingers curled tighter around the key. "I wasn't here for him." The dog did not care about apologies. Ranger only knew the truth, that Henry had left one day and never returned. And so, Ranger had waited, through rain and snow, through the blistering heat of summer, through the loneliness that stretched across each hour like an open wound. Ethan had no right to stand here now. And yet, he did. The dog's ears flicked, his body shifting, as if he could feel the weight of something more than just a stranger's return. Something unspoken, something that had been waiting to break. "You think if you stay long enough he'll come back?" Ethan whispered. "You think if you don't leave, he won't be gone?" Ranger stiffened. Ethan's grip on the key loosened slightly. "I know," he murmured, "because I thought the same thing." The words were foreign to him, truths he had buried so deeply that even he hadn't realized they were there. He thought back to the day he had left, to the moment when he had walked away from this house, from his father, from the life he had decided wasn't enough. He had been angry at Henry for not wanting more, for staying in this small town, for choosing a life that wasn't filled with ambition, with wealth, with power. He had wanted everything. And in the process, he had left behind the only thing that had ever mattered: his father. And now, Henry was gone. The weight of that truth was suffocating. Ethan let out a breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I got the letter too late," he admitted, his voice rough. "I was halfway across the country when they told me. I thought—" He stopped himself, his throat tightening. "I thought I'd have more time." More time. It was a cruel illusion, the kind that tricked you into believing you could always go back, that you could always say the things you left unsaid. But Henry had died without hearing his son's voice one last time, and Ranger had been the only one who stayed. The dog's ears twitched, but he remained unmoving. Ethan dropped his gaze to the porch. Henry's old chair was still there, untouched, as if waiting for its owner to return. The coffee cup that had once rested on the wooden armrest was gone, but the memory of it remained. Ethan shouldn't be here, but neither should this house, frozen in time. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward. Ranger's growl deepened. Ethan stopped. The dog wasn't ready, and maybe neither was he. Ethan exhaled. "All right," he murmured. "I get it." He stepped back, lowering himself to the ground. He didn't try to touch Ranger. He didn't try to force his way past. Instead, he just sat there, his back against the steps, his fingers still clutching the key. "You're not the only one who lost him," he whispered. Ranger's golden eyes flickered with something that wasn't anger, but wasn't trust either. Something between them cracked. Not fully, not completely, but just enough. Ethan stared at the empty fields beyond the house. "Did he ever talk about me?" he asked softly. The dog didn't answer. Ethan didn't expect him to. But the silence was enough, because silence was all Henry had left behind. The guilt settled deep inside Ethan's chest. "I should have called," he murmured. "I should have written back." He clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. "But I didn't." And now, it was too late. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. He had spent so many years running from this town, from this house, from his father. But you couldn't outrun grief, and neither could Ranger. The dog had been waiting for Henry. But deep down, maybe, he had been waiting for Ethan too. Neither of them had moved forward. Neither of them had known how. The wind howled through the trees, but this time it didn't feel like it was pulling Ethan away. This time, it felt like it was holding him here. Ranger let out a soft, low exhale. Not a growl, not a snarl. Just a breath. And for the first time, Ethan let himself breathe too. His fingers loosened around the key. And when he looked back at Ranger, something between them had changed. They were still strangers. They were still wounded, broken things. But they were not alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. The night had settled over the house, draping it in shadows and silence. The wind had died down, leaving only the creak of tree branches and the occasional rustling of leaves. The world felt still. Too still. Ethan sat on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely clasped. Ranger was near him, not close enough to be called companionship, but no longer standing in opposition. The German shepherd lay on the wooden boards, his head resting between his paws, ears flicking every so often to the sounds of the night. Neither of them had spoken in hours. Not that there were words for what lay between them. It wasn't trust, but it wasn't hostility either. It was something fragile, something waiting to break. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, staring at the darkened fields stretching beyond the house. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered. Ranger didn't lift his head, but his tail flicked slightly against the wood. Ethan let out a breath. "Maybe I shouldn't be here," he admitted. "Maybe you're right to want me gone." A pause, a breath, a weight in the air. "But if I leave, you'll just keep waiting, won't you?" Ranger's ears twitched. "You don't have to," Ethan said, his voice quieter. "He's not coming back." The words hurt. They burned as they left his lips, like an open wound being touched for the first time. Ranger flinched. For the first time, the dog reacted to the truth that neither of them wanted to face. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. "You know that, don't you?" he murmured. "You just don't want to let go." Neither did he. Ethan glanced back at the house, at the darkened windows that had once been filled with warmth and life. A part of him expected to see Henry standing there, arms crossed, watching them with quiet amusement. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. Just loss. Ethan clenched his jaw, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "You think, if you keep waiting, he'll come back," he whispered. "But that's not how it works." A gust of wind moved through the trees. The branches swayed, casting eerie shadows across the porch. The house groaned, settling into itself like an old man shifting in his chair. And then, the sound of footsteps. Ethan's head snapped up. Ranger's body went rigid, his ears straining forward, nose twitching. The steps weren't his. They weren't the weightless scurry of animals or the distant crunch of neighbors passing by. They were deliberate. They were close. Ethan rose to his feet slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. "What the hell?" Ranger was already up, his stance low, his body tensed like a coiled spring. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Ethan squinted into the night, his heart beginning to pound. And then, the sound came again, closer. Ranger barked, loud, sharp, a warning. And this time something moved in the dark. Ethan took a step forward, his fists clenching. "Who's there?" The silence stretched, long and thick. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, thin, wrapped in an old, tattered coat. Their face was obscured by the dim light, but their movements were slow, cautious. Ethan felt something cold snake down his spine. "Hey!" The figure stopped. Ranger was snarling now, his teeth bared, his entire body a wall of muscle and tension. The person lifted their hands, not in surrender but in something else. Something Ethan didn't trust. "I didn't think anyone was still here," the voice rasped. It was low, scratchy, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. Ethan's gut twisted. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger tilted their head slightly. "I could ask you the same thing." Ranger lunged forward, barking furiously. The figure took a step back. "Easy, boy." Ethan's fists tightened. "You didn't answer me?" The stranger exhaled, their breath curling in the cold air. "Just someone passing through." "Bullshit," Ethan snapped. "You weren't passing through. You were watching." The stranger didn't deny it. Ethan's mind raced. This house had been abandoned for months. Had this person been here before? Had they been waiting for Henry to be gone? His stomach churned at the thought. Ranger took another step forward, his growl deepening. He didn't trust the stranger, neither did Ethan. The man sighed. "Relax, I was just curious." Ethan didn't believe that for a second. "You should leave," he said flatly. The stranger chuckled. "Maybe. But it's a shame, isn't it? This house, just sitting here, empty." A cold shiver ran through Ethan's spine. This wasn't just a passing encounter. The man had been waiting for an opportunity, and now that Henry was gone, he thought he had one. Ethan stepped forward, his presence solid, unmoving. "Get out of here." The stranger tilted his head again, as if considering. Ranger barked again, louder this time. The man sighed. All right. No need to get all worked up." He turned slowly, retreating back into the darkness. Ethan didn't move until he could no longer hear his footsteps. His breath left him in a shaky exhale. He turned back to Ranger, who was still stiff, still watching. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I don't like him either." The dog gave a soft huff, as if in agreement. Ethan ran a hand down his face. Had someone been watching this house all along? Had someone been waiting for Henry to be gone? The thought made his stomach churn. He looked back at Ranger. The dog was still staring into the darkness, his body tense, his instincts still sharp. For months he had been waiting for Henry to come home. But now Ethan understood. Ranger hadn't just been waiting. He had been guarding. Because something else had been waiting too. Ethan wasn't leaving. Not now. Not when there was still something to protect. He turned toward the house, toward the dark windows that still carried his father's memory. Ethan exhaled. Then, at last, he stepped inside. Ranger followed, and the door closed behind them. The house breathed with silence. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, feeling like a stranger in a place that had once been his home. Nothing had changed. The walls still held the same old photographs, the furniture still bore the weight of years of use, and the air carried the faintest trace of Henry's scent. Wood smoke, coffee, and something distinctly him. And yet everything felt different. The man who had lived here, the man who had made this place feel whole, was gone. And the only one who had refused to accept it lay beside the old recliner, waiting. Ranger's body was curled tightly against the wooden floor, his ears still perked, as if listening for something only he could hear. His golden eyes were fixed on a spot near the door, where Henry had once stood every morning, coffee in hand, greeting the world like it was an old friend. But the door had not opened in months, and it never would again. Ethan swallowed hard, running a hand down his face. His father's absence was everywhere, in the untouched books on the table, in the unwashed coffee cup sitting on the kitchen counter. in the empty space where his boots used to rest by the door. Ranger had been holding on to all of it. For 6 long months, the dog had waited. Through scorching summers, through freezing nights, through the quiet that stretched endlessly across the days. And Ethan had the sickening feeling that if he hadn't shown up, Ranger would have waited forever. His chest tightened. He had come back to say goodbye, to lock the house, to settle whatever lingering matters still tied him to this place, to move on. But looking at Ranger, seeing the way the dog still hadn't let go, Ethan knew he couldn't just walk away. Not again. He exhaled, stepping closer. The wooden floor groaned beneath his weight, but Ranger didn't move. "You know," Ethan murmured, his voice rough, "he wouldn't have wanted you to do this." Ranger's ears twitched slightly. "You were his best friend." Ethan knelt beside him, resting his elbows on his knees. "You never left his side. You protected him." The dog didn't look at him. He only blinked slowly, still watching the door, still hoping. Ethan let out a breath. "But he's not coming back." Ranger flinched. It was subtle, so small that someone else might not have noticed. But Ethan did, because the truth hurt. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, something that had been folded so many times it was nearly falling apart. He smoothed out the edges, letting his fingers linger over the worn paper before holding it out for Ranger to see. It was a photo, an old one. A much younger version of himself sat on his father's shoulders, arms stretched wide like wings. Henry had been smiling, really smiling, his eyes crinkled at the corners, his grip steady, unwavering. Ethan swallowed hard. "He used to tell me I was always running," he murmured. "Even as a kid. Said I never liked to sit still, always had to chase after something bigger." His lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. He wasn't wrong. He stared down at the photograph, feeling the weight of every year between then and now. "I spent my whole life running away from here," Ethan admitted. "From him, from this place. I thought I was meant for something bigger." His fingers curled around the edges of the photo. "But the truth is," his throat tightened, "I should have come back." The words felt heavy, real, in a way they never had before. For so long, he had blamed his father for being content with so little, for staying in this town, in this house, for building a life that wasn't extraordinary. But standing here now, with his father gone and only silence left in his place, Ethan realized something. Henry's life hadn't been small. It had been full, full of meaning, full of love, full of loyalty, the kind that Ethan had spent years running away from, and the only one who had understood it all along was the dog lying beside him. Ethan exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were the only one who stayed." Ranger finally turned his head, his golden eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You stayed because you loved him," Ethan said. Ranger didn't blink. Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing against the old wooden floor. "I didn't," he admitted, the confession burning his throat. "I ran when I should have stayed. I left when I should have been here." Silence. Ranger's ears twitched. And then, slowly, carefully, he lifted his head from his paws. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "You don't have to wait anymore," he murmured. Ranger stared at him, and then, as if something had finally cracked, the dog let out a long, slow breath. Ethan watched as Ranger's body uncoiled, just slightly. For the first time, he wasn't braced for Henry's return. For the first time, he was listening. Ethan reached out slowly, hesitantly, giving Ranger the choice to pull away. But the dog didn't. Instead, he leaned forward, pressing his head against Ethan's hand. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. For months, Ranger had been alone, waiting, guarding, holding on to a promise he couldn't break. But he wasn't alone anymore. Ethan was here, and this time, he wasn't leaving. The weight in the room shifted. The house still carried its silence, but it no longer felt suffocating. Ethan took a slow breath. He reached down, scratching behind Ranger's ears, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur beneath his fingers. "You and me, buddy," he murmured. "We figure this out together." Ranger let out a small, almost reluctant sigh, but he didn't pull away. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but it no longer felt like it was pushing Ethan away. This time, it felt like it was welcoming him home. The first light of dawn seeped through the windows, painting the walls in soft, golden hues. The house, once a tomb of silence, now held something else. A breath, a heartbeat, a beginning. Ethan sat on the floor beside Henry's old recliner, his back resting against it. His legs were stretched out, his fingers lazily running through Ranger's thick fur. The dog had finally relaxed, his body no longer stiff with anticipation, no longer waiting for footsteps that would never return. For the first time in 6 months, Ranger was resting, and for the first time in years, so was Ethan. The wind rattled against the old wooden frame of the house, but it wasn't unsettling anymore. It was just a sound, another piece of life moving forward. Ethan exhaled, his fingers curled around the old folded photograph in his other hand. The picture of himself and Henry, a time before resentment, before distance, before regret. He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, carefully, he unfolded it completely and set it down on the mantel, not hidden, not shoved away, but where it belonged. Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching him. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. "I'm not leaving," he murmured, answering the question the dog didn't ask. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Ethan stretched, letting his body adjust to the morning stiffness. He glanced toward the window, toward the fields beyond the house, the land his father had walked every morning, the place where memories still lingered. Maybe they always would, but that was okay. Ethan pushed himself to his feet and looked down at Ranger. "Come on, buddy," he said, nudging the dog's side. "Let's go outside." Ranger hesitated only for a second before getting up, his muscles rolling beneath his thick coat as he stretched. Ethan opened the door, stepping onto the porch. The air was crisp, the world painted in the soft pastels of morning. It was beautiful. And for the first time, he saw it the way his father had always seen it. A place of peace, of purpose, of home. Ranger trotted down the steps, his nose to the ground, sniffing the fresh scent of dew on the grass. His tail swayed lazily, his body loose, his mind, for the first time in months, no longer trapped in the past. Ethan followed him down, stretching his arms over his head, feeling the ache in his muscles from the tension he had carried for too long. It felt lighter now. He ran a hand over the old wooden railing of the porch, his father's handiwork still holding strong. And that's when he knew. He wasn't just staying for a few days. He wasn't here to say goodbye. He was home. Not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. Because this house wasn't just Henry's anymore. It was his, and Ranger's. A new chapter, a new beginning, a promise, one he wouldn't break this time. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to the house. He had work to do, but for the first time in his life, he was ready. Ranger sat beside him, staring out at the open land, his golden eyes reflecting the rising sun. Together, they moved forward. Together, they stayed.